The air in the Joint Operations Command Center tasted of grit, stale coffee, and the low electric hum of anticipatory dread. It was a manufactured space, a metal box dropped into the unforgiving ochre dust of a forgotten war, a temporary nerve center pretending at permanence. Cables, thick as pythons, snaked across the raised floor, feeding a constellation of monitors that cast a cold, blue-white light on the faces of the men and women gathered within. Each screen was a window onto a different facet of the same lethal problem. Maps gridded with hostile vectors, drone feeds showing heat signatures shifting in the distant dark, and encrypted chat logs scrolling with terse, clipped updates from assets in the field. The atmosphere was a physical weight, a compound of low barometric pressure from the brewing sandstorm outside and the even lower pressure of imminent kinetic violence. The only sound, besides the thrum of the servers and the whisper of the industrial air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the desert, was the soft, rhythmic tap of a single finger on a keyboard, a sound as persistent and unnerving as a dripping faucet in a silent house. In a corner, away from the central cluster of activity around the main holographic map table, sat a figure who seemed to be the very source of the room's ambient stillness. She was a United States Navy Chief Petty Officer, though one would have to look closely at the single, subdued anchor on her collar to know it. Her uniform, a standard Navy working uniform, was functional, devoid of the colorful fruit salad of ribbons and badges that adorned many of the others in the room. It was slightly rumpled, as if she had been wearing it for 3 days straight, which she had. She was not large or physically imposing. Her hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun, revealing a face that was more geometry than flesh. All angles and planes, with eyes the color of a winter sea. She was observing the room, but not in the way a predator observes its prey. It was the observation of a seismograph, a passive instrument designed to register the faintest tremors, to record data without judgment or emotion. Her hands rested on her knees, one cupping the other, in a posture of perfect, economical rest. She had not spoken a word in 6 hours. To most of the room, she was just another body, a specialist of some obscure sort, probably a linguist or a low-level intelligence analyst, brought in to support the primary effort. She was furniture, an inconvenient necessity. Captain John Rourke, United States Marine Corps, was the antithesis of this stillness. He was a man carved from a different, louder material. Where she was silence, he was noise. Where she was motionlessness, he was a constant churn of restless energy. He paced the perimeter of the command hub, his boots striking the metal floor with an authority he felt was his birthright. His jaw was a granite slab, his neck was as thick as a mooring post, and his face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, all sharp lines and aggressive certainty. They called him Bull Rourke, and he had spent his entire career leaning into the moniker. He saw the world as a series of obstacles to be smashed through, of subordinates to be cowed, and of superiors to be impressed with his sheer, unadulterated aggression. Authority, to Captain Rourke, was not a responsibility to be borne. It was a space to be occupied, loudly. It radiated from him like heat from a furnace, a dry, overbearing force that made junior officers flinch and senior officers sigh with weary resignation. He was a useful tool, a battering ram, but one that often broke the door frame along with the door. Rourke's pacing brought him, inevitably, to the quiet corner where the silent chief sat. His gaze, which had been sweeping the room for any sign of slackness or incompetence, settled on her. He saw a woman, small and unassuming, in a Navy uniform, sitting perfectly still while men, his men, SEALs, Green Berets, were on their feet, wired, ready. His mind, a machine honed for snap judgments based on ingrained prejudice, processed the image and produced an immediate, contemptuous conclusion. She did not belong here. This space, this crucible of imminent warfare, was for warriors, for men like him. His lip curled in a sneer that was almost imperceptible to others, but was a tectonic shift on the landscape of his face. He saw her not as a fellow service member, but as a clerical error, a misplaced piece of administrative baggage. The tension in the room, the long, agonizing wait for the final go order, needed a release valve, and his frustration had just found its target. He stopped directly in front of her, planting his boots a little wider than necessary, a subconscious assertion of dominance. He loomed, casting her in his shadow. The few people who noticed the interaction tensed, recognizing the prelude to one of Rourke's infamous verbal broadsides. They were ugly, public affairs, designed to humiliate and establish his place at the top of the food chain. "Chief," he began, his voice a low rumble that cut through the electronic hum of the room. He did not use her name because he had not bothered to learn it. He did not see a person, only a rank and a gender, and in his calculus, the latter negated the former. "You look a little lost. The galley is 2 containers down. I'm sure someone over there could use a hand with the coffee." The words hung in the air, thick and oily. It was a classic Rourke gambit, a public dismissal wrapped in a veneer of condescending helpfulness. It was designed to provoke a reaction, anger, tears, a flustered defense, any of which would confirm his initial assessment of her weakness and irrelevance. It was a power play, pure and simple. Chief Petty Officer Anya Sharma did not move. Her eyes, which had been scanning the room, slowly lifted to meet his. They were flat, devoid of anger, fear, or any recognizable emotion. They were the eyes of a camera lens, simply recording the data before them. She did not flinch. She did not blush. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched into uncomfortable territory for Rourke. He was used to his verbal jabs landing with immediate effect. Her silence was a void, and it unnerved him. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, clear, and utterly devoid of inflection. "I am where I need to be, Captain." It was a simple statement of fact. There was no defiance in it, no sarcasm, no challenge. It was the verbal equivalent of a brick wall. It offered him nothing to push against, nothing to leverage. The quiet finality of it was more infuriating to Rourke than any shouted retort could have been. He had thrown a punch and hit water. The lack of a satisfying impact sent a surge of hot, frustrated anger through his veins. The eyes of the room were on him now, and he could feel his authority being subtly questioned, not by her, but by her absolute refusal to acknowledge his power. "Is that so?" he snarled, leaning in closer, invading her personal space. The smell of his aggression, a mix of sweat, caffeine, and masculine pride, washed over her. "Because from where I'm standing, you're taking up valuable space in a Tier 1 operational environment. This isn't a library. This is the sharp end of the spear. So I'll ask you again. What is your function here?" He was demanding she justify her existence. He was putting her on trial in front of her peers. And he was both prosecutor and judge. The other operators in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some secretly agreed with Rourke's sentiment. Others were simply embarrassed by the brutishness of the display. None intervened. It was not their place. Sharma's gaze did not waver. She seemed like a lioness, allowing a jackal to dance and yap at the very edge of its kill radius, utterly unconcerned by the display because it posed no actual threat. The silence stretched again, each second a turn of the screw on Rourke's temper. "I am monitoring," she said at last, her voice as calm and steady as before. "Monitoring?" Rourke laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Monitoring what? The dust settling. We have 24 signals intelligence and electronic warfare specialists for that, Chief. Highly trained professionals." The insult was clear. She was not one of them. He was so consumed by his own performance, so blinded by his prejudice, that he failed to notice the subtle details. He did not see that the console next to her, which appeared dark and inactive to the casual observer, was in fact running a diagnostic cascade in a deep system mode, its indicators visible only from a specific angle. He did not notice that her stillness was not passivity, but a state of profound concentration, like a grandmaster contemplating a chessboard. He saw a woman in a chair. He did not see the weapon she was. Frustrated beyond measure by her infuriating calm, he made his final, critical mistake. He reached down and slapped his hand on the console beside her, the sound a sharp crack in the tense quiet. "This is not a spectator sport, Chief. If you don't have a purpose, get out. Now." It was a physical act of intimidation, a final attempt to shatter her composure. Sharma's eyes flickered down to his hand on the console, then back up to his face. For the first time, a flicker of something registered in their depths. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something colder, more analytical. It was the look of an engineer diagnosing a faulty component. She did not speak. She simply raised one hand slowly, and with 2 fingers, gently pushed his hand off the sensitive diagnostic port he had just covered. Her touch was light, almost dismissive. She then withdrew her hand and placed it back on her knee, resuming her posture of perfect stillness. She did not flinch. She did not turn. She had dismissed him as one might dismiss a fly. For Captain Bull Rourke, this was the ultimate insult. He was a force of nature, and this woman, this nobody, had treated him as if he were nothing. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red. He opened his mouth to unleash a tirade that would have ended her career, a torrent of fury and rank that would burn her out of this room and this theater of operations for good. But the words never came. At that exact moment, the world ended. A single, piercing alarm sliced through the command center, a high-frequency shriek that signaled catastrophic failure. Simultaneously, every one of the 24 monitors blinked, fizzled, and died, plunging the room into a disorienting gloom, lit only by the emergency red battle lamps that flickered on with a hum of their own. The drone feeds vanished. The maps disappeared. The encrypted comms channels went dead, replaced by a roaring cascade of white noise. The low, comforting hum of the servers and generators outside faltered, replaced by the groaning, tortured sound of failing machinery. The room, which seconds before had been the all-seeing eye of the entire military operation, was now blind, deaf, and dumb. Panic, a cold and greasy serpent, began to uncoil in the pit of every stomach. "What the hell was that?" someone shouted into the red-tinged darkness. "Comms are down! All channels!" another voice yelled, his tone laced with rising hysteria. "I've got nothing but static. Satellite link is gone. Primary, secondary, tertiary, all flatlined." The ranking officer in the room, an Air Force colonel named Davies, began barking orders, his voice tight with strain. "Get me a sit rep. Somebody get J6 on the line. Reroute through the backup array. Now! Move!" His orders were textbook, standard operating procedure for a minor communications glitch. But this was not a minor glitch. This was a decapitation. His commands were useless because the very systems he was ordering his men to use no longer existed. He was a captain shouting orders on a ship that had already sunk beneath the waves. Captain Rourke, his personal vendetta instantly forgotten, reverted to his default setting, shouting, "Lock it down! Everyone stay at your stations! I want status reports from every section, on the double!" He was trying to impose order through sheer volume, but his voice was just another layer of noise in the growing chaos. He stomped towards the main comm station, shoving a junior airman out of the way, and began uselessly cycling through dead channels, his frustration mounting with every silent click of the dial. He was a bull in a dark room, powerful but blind, smashing into walls he could not see. The conventional authorities, the men of rank and bluster, were failing. Their systems, their protocols, their entire worldview had been predicated on the assumption that the tools would always work. Now the tools were broken, and they were revealed to be nothing more than terrified men in a dark metal box. Just then, a runner burst through the blast door, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Sir, we just got a flash transmission on the old burst laser comm before it went down. Intel from Asset Zero. They're coming, sir. It's the whole network. Coordinated attack, multiple vectors, targeting our staging areas. Their window is now, while we're blind." The news fell into the room like a nerve agent. An imminent, complex attack, and they had no way to see it coming, no way to communicate with their forces in the field, no way to coordinate a defense. They were dead. The next 15 minutes would be a slaughter. It was in this precise moment of absolute paralyzing chaos that Anya Sharma moved. For hours, she had been a fixed point, a study in potential energy. Now that energy was released. She did not jump to her feet. She rose in a single fluid motion, a seamless transition from stillness to action that was breathtaking in its efficiency. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, and for a moment, she seemed to be everywhere at once. Her previous quietness had not been passivity, it had been the intake of breath before the plunge. She ignored the shouting colonel and the bellowing captain. They were part of the background noise, part of the problem she was here to solve. Her movements were not rushed. They were impossibly precise, each step and gesture calibrated for maximum effect with zero wasted energy. She crossed the room not to the main communications hub, where Rourke was fumbling uselessly, but to a small, unassuming maintenance panel set low in the wall, a panel no one had even noticed. With a deft movement, she popped the cover. Inside was not the expected tangle of multicolored wires, but a single fiber optic port glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light. From a small, flat pouch on her belt, she produced a coiled black cable and a small, featureless gray box, no larger than a deck of cards. She jacked the cable into the port and then into the box. Her fingers then moved to the console next to where she had been sitting, the one Rourke had struck. It flickered to life, not with the standard user interface, but with lines of stark white code cascading down a black screen at an impossible speed. "Lockhart," she said, her voice cutting through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. It was not loud, but it carried an intrinsic authority that silenced the room. Men turned from their dead consoles to stare at her. "Give me a direct handshake with the Aegis platform. Bypass the orbital relays. I need a clean, quantum-entangled stream. Authenticate with code Praetorian 9 Sigma." A young Air Force lieutenant named Lockhart, one of the top cyber warfare specialists in the theater, stared at her, his mouth agape. "Chief, the QE comms are theoretical. They're a prototype. We don't have the hardware, and even if we did, The encryption keys are held at the National Security Agency level. Sharma did not look up from the screen. Lines of code were flowing from her fingertips, a language that was both alien and beautiful. I am the hardware, Lieutenant, and I hold the keys. Now do as I say. Isolate carrier wave delta. I need to piggyback a signal burst on the background radiation. Filter for Hawking radiation decay signatures from the M87 galactic core. The technical jargon descended on the room like a physical force. It was a foreign language of expertise, a dialect spoken only at the highest, most classified levels of advanced military science. It was the language of creation, of bending the very laws of physics to one's will. The lieutenant, Lockhart, a man who held 3 doctorates and was considered a prodigy, could only stare, his mind struggling to keep up with the concepts she was deploying with such casual mastery. He was a student in the presence of a grandmaster. He quickly, silently, began to comply, his fingers flying across his own keyboard, trying to keep pace with her commands. Colonel Davies took a step toward her. "Chief, what do you think you're doing? Who gave you the authority?" "I did," Sharma stated, still not looking up. "You have an imminent, multi-pronged attack on your sector. You are blind, deaf, and have approximately 8 minutes until your forwardmost elements are overrun. You have 2 choices. You can stand there and question my authority, in which case you and most of your command will be dead in a quarter of an hour. Or you can secure this room, silence all non-essential personnel, and let me do my job." There was no anger in her voice. It was a clinical presentation of facts. The sheer, unassailable logic of her statement, combined with the impossible feat she was attempting, held the colonel in place. He looked from her, a figure of absolute focused calm, to the panicked faces of his own men, and he made the only sane choice. "Do it," he breathed. Then, finding his command voice again, he barked, "You heard her! Lock this room down! Everyone not directly assisting the chief, silence, now!" Captain Rourke stood frozen by the main comms console, a statue of obsolete fury. He watched her, this woman he had tried to humiliate, and his mind simply could not process what was happening. It was as if a janitor had suddenly started performing open-heart surgery in the middle of the hallway. The world had turned upside down. His entire understanding of rank, authority, and competence was being dismantled before his eyes. He watched her fingers dance across the keys, watched the lines of code scroll, and a cold, terrifying dread began to creep into his soul. It was the dread of a man realizing he has made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. He had not just insulted a chief petty officer. He had insulted something else. I have a partial handshake," she announced, her voice still a calm, steady metronome against the frantic beat of the passing seconds. "It's dirty. The enemy is using a wide-spectrum jamming field, targeting our satellite frequencies. Amateur, but effective. They're not expecting a QE uplink." She paused, her head tilted slightly as if listening to a distant sound. "They're spoofing our IFF tags. The attack isn't just external. They have assets inside our wire. They're going to try and turn our own automated defenses against us." Her fingers became a blur. New windows of code opened on her screen. She was fighting a war on a battlefield no one else in the room could even see. She was dueling with ghosts in the machine, her mind moving at the speed of light, her commands flowing into the system like a counter-virus. "Lockhart, I'm shunting the IFF authenticator through my terminal. I'm building a new verification protocol on the fly. It will purge the spoofed tags, but it will only hold for 90 seconds. Tell the colonel he has a minute and a half to manually deactivate all automated turret and SAM systems before they start firing on our own people." Lockhart, his face beaded with sweat, relayed the message. The colonel, his face a mask of disbelief, began shouting orders into a handheld radio that had just crackled to life with a signal she had evidently re-established. The room watched, mesmerized. It was a masterclass in crisis management, a symphony of technical brilliance and ice-cold nerve. She was single-handedly rewiring the central nervous system of a multi-billion-dollar military apparatus while under unimaginable pressure. The arrogance and panic had evaporated from the room, replaced by a profound, collective awe. They were witnessing something that would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones for years. They were watching a legend being forged in real time. Captain Rourke could not move. He could only watch her, his own loud, useless authority shrinking to a single, pathetic point of shame. He had stood on a mountain of pride and bellowed at the sky, only to have the sky answer back in a voice of quiet, terrifying competence. Just as Sharma rerouted the last of the critical data streams, establishing a fragile but functional picture of the battlefield on the main holographic display, the blast door to the command center hissed open again. The light from the corridor outside was a brilliant, shocking white against the red gloom within. Framed in the doorway was a figure that made every person in the room, colonel, captain, and airman alike, instinctively straighten their backs. It was General Wallace. 4 stars glittered on his collar. He was a living legend in the special operations community, a man who had commanded at every level from platoon to the entire Joint Special Operations Command. His presence was less an arrival and more of a manifestation. He was the commander of the entire theater, and his face was a mask of cold fury. He had come down to the epicenter of the communications blackout to find out who had allowed his entire operation to be blinded at the most critical possible moment. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to assessing chaos in an instant, swept the room. He saw the red lights, the dead screens, the pale, stressed faces of the command staff. He saw Colonel Davies shouting orders, and he saw Captain Rourke standing frozen like a scarecrow. His gaze was about to settle on Davies, his expression promising a storm of wrath, when it caught on the lone, active console in the corner. He saw the woman working there, her back to him, her focus absolute. He took a step into the room, his eyes narrowing. He saw the improvised setup, the gray box, the cascade of code on the screen. He saw her sleeve, pushed up to her forearm from the frantic pace of her work. And then he saw it. It was small, barely visible in the dim red light. A tattoo just above the wrist bone of her right hand. It was not the famous seal trident. It was something else, something far more arcane. It was a simple, stylized design in black ink. A blindfolded woman holding a perfectly balanced scale in one hand and a single bare circuit board in the other. It was the insignia of a unit so secret that its existence was denied even at the highest levels of the Pentagon. It was the mark of the Directorate of Special Technology and Tactics, the auditors, the ghosts in the machine. They were the ultimate failsafe, the troubleshooters who troubleshot the troubleshooters, the Praetorians of the digital age. They did not exist on any official roster. They moved between units and theaters, their authority absolute and their mission known only to a handful of men like General Wallace. General Wallace, a man who had not shown surprise in 30 years, stopped dead. His expression of fury dissolved, replaced by something else entirely. A look of profound, instantaneous recognition and respect. The 4-star general, the supreme commander of hundreds of thousands of troops, straightened his own posture. His back went ramrod straight. He took a sharp breath, and his voice boomed through the now silent room, a parade ground command that cracked like a whip. "Attention on deck!" The effect was electric. Every person in the room, from Colonel Davies down to the youngest airman, snapped to the position of attention. It was a reflex, drilled into them by years of training, but it was followed by a wave of utter confusion. The command was reserved for the arrival of a flag officer of equal or greater rank. General Wallace himself was the one giving the command. Who were they coming to attention for? They looked around, bewildered, their eyes darting between the general and the door. General Wallace ignored them. He strode purposefully across the room, his boots echoing in the stunned silence. He did not approach Colonel Davies. He walked directly to the unassuming woman at the corner console. He stopped 3 feet behind her, standing at a perfect position of parade rest, a gesture of deference from a superior to a specialist engaged in a critical task. He waited. Anya Sharma typed one final line of code, hit enter, and the main holographic map bloomed into full, stable, 3-dimensional life. The enemy attack vectors were now clearly marked in red, and the blue icons of friendly forces were already moving to intercept, guided by the data she had just provided. The crisis was averted. The slaughter had been prevented. She took a slow breath, the first relaxed breath she had taken in an hour, and rolled her shoulders. Only then did she seem to become aware of the 4-star general standing behind her. She slowly turned on her stool, her face calm, her eyes clear. General Wallace looked at her, and the respect in his eyes was deep and genuine. He did not address her as Chief. He did not use her name. He used the title that corresponded to the tattoo on her wrist. "Auditor," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Report." The word auditor fell into the silent room like a bomb. It meant nothing to most, but to the senior officers, it was the key to an impossible lock. Colonel Davis's face went white. He had heard whispers, ghost stories at high-level briefings about a unit with that designation, a unit of one, a single operator who possessed the authority to override any command, any protocol, any officer, up to and including a theater commander, if they deemed it necessary to preserve a critical system. They were a myth. A boogeyman used to scare straight, arrogant colonels and generals. The narrator's voice would later fill in the details for those who would tell the story. Chief Petty Officer Anya Sharma. Call sign, Praetorian. Lead Field Auditor for the Directorate of Special Technology and Tactics. A ghost who walked in daylight. Her file was a ghost as well. A string of blacked-out assignments and commendations so classified they had their own classification. She was a prodigy, recruited out of MIT's Advanced Cybernetics Lab, who had then gone on to complete SEAL training with honors, not because she needed to be a door kicker, but because the directorate demanded its auditors understand the consequences of failure on the battlefield from the ground up. She was not just an operator. She was the operating system. Her job was to float through the military's most critical nodes, observing, testing, and when necessary, intervening. She was the system's immune response, its ultimate guardian. Captain Bull Rourke stood frozen at attention, his body rigid but his mind collapsing. The blood drained from his face. The woman he had tried to send for coffee, the woman he had publicly humiliated and physically intimidated, was not just a chief. She was a figure of almost mythical authority, a being who operated on a plane so far above him that he couldn't even comprehend it. The full, crushing weight of his arrogance, his prejudice, his catastrophic misjudgment came crashing down on him. It was a weight that buckled his knees and stole the air from his lungs. He was no longer a captain in the United States Marine Corps. He was a fool. A public, unmitigated, historical fool. Sharma's gaze left the general and drifted across the room, finally settling on Rourke. Her expression was still unreadable, as clinical as a diagnostic report. The personal conflict, which seemed so monumental just minutes ago, was now a footnote to a much larger event. But it was a footnote that needed to be addressed. She rose slowly from her stool and walked toward him. Each soft footstep on the metal floor was a hammer blow to Rourke's shattered pride. She stopped directly in front of him. He was still taller, still physically larger, but in that moment, he had never felt so small. "Captain Rourke," she said, her voice a quiet force of nature. She did not raise it. She did not need to. Every person in the room was straining to hear. "Your actions earlier were not a personal insult. I am not insulted. My emotional state is irrelevant to the mission. What your actions represent is a critical tactical failure." She paused, letting the words sink in. She was not dressing him down. She was dissecting him. "Your primary function as an officer is to assess the battle space and effectively deploy the assets within it. You saw me, and you did not see an asset. You saw a stereotype. You allowed a personal prejudice, a cognitive bias based on gender and my quiet demeanor, to override your tactical judgment. You failed to gather intelligence. You failed to ask a single relevant question. Instead, you made an assumption, and based on that flawed assumption, you attempted to remove a critical asset from the operational environment at the most crucial possible moment." She took a small step closer. "Your behavior was not just unprofessional, Captain. It was a vulnerability. It was a weakness in the command structure that, had circumstances been slightly different, could have led to the catastrophic loss of life and the failure of this entire operation. You did not see a person. You did not see a sailor. You saw a woman, and you decided her value without evidence. You are a liability, Captain Rourke, not because you are arrogant, but because your arrogance makes you blind." She fell silent. The surgical deconstruction was complete. She had not attacked his pride. She had dismantled his professional identity, piece by piece, using the cold, hard logic of their shared trade. General Wallace walked over to stand beside her. He looked down at the quivering, ash-faced captain. "Captain Rourke," the general's voice was ice. "I should have you brought up on charges that would end your career before sunrise. Your conduct was an embarrassment to your uniform and a danger to this command." Rourke could only manage a choked whisper. "Sir." "No excuse, sir." General Wallace looked at Sharma. "Auditor, what is your recommendation for the captain's remediation?" The room held its breath. This was the moment of judgment. A court-martial, a reduction in rank, a dishonorable discharge, all were on the table. Sharma looked at Rourke, her eyes analytical. "Formal punishment is inefficient, General. It teaches fear, not understanding. The captain's failure is one of perspective. Therefore, his remediation must be a change in perspective." She turned her gaze back to the general. "I request Captain Rourke be assigned to my personal staff, effective immediately. He will serve as my executive aide for the duration of my deployment in this theater." A collective gasp, silent but palpable, went through the room. It was a fate worse than any brig. He would be her bag carrier. He would manage her schedule. He would stand outside rooms while she briefed generals. He, Captain Bull Rourke, the alpha male, the warrior, would be reduced to the role of a glorified secretary for the very woman he had tried to send for coffee. He would be forced, every single day, to witness her competence, to facilitate her authority, and to exist in the shadow of her legend. It was not punishment. It was education, delivered in its most potent, humiliating, and inescapable form. General Wallace allowed a grim, thin smile to touch his lips. "A brilliant recommendation, Auditor. Your request is granted. Captain Rourke, you are relieved of your command. Report to the Auditor for duty. Dismissed." The story of that day in the JOC passed into the annals of military lore. It became a modern fable, a teaching tool told at Annapolis and West Point, a cautionary tale for young, arrogant officers who believed authority was measured in decibels. The details, as they always do, grew with each telling. The sandstorm became a typhoon. The communications failure became a direct hit from an experimental enemy weapon. Sharma's 90-second fix became a 10-second miracle. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. Years passed. The name Captain Bull Rourke faded from memory. In its place, a different reputation grew, that of Lieutenant Colonel John Rourke, an instructor at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. He was known as a quiet, thoughtful, and profoundly effective teacher. His most famous lecture, the one that every student remembered, was on the subject of cognitive bias in leadership. He would stand before a room full of young, confident captains, men and women who reminded him so much of his younger self. He would stand not behind a podium, but in the center of the room, and he would tell them a story. He would tell them about a dark, red-lit room in a desert far away. He would tell them about a quiet chief petty officer and a loud, foolish captain. He never used his own name when he told it, but the older instructors knew. They knew that the foolish captain in the story was him. "Your greatest enemy as a leader," he would conclude, his voice quiet but resonant, "is not the one across the battlefield. It is the one in your own mind. It is the assumption that you know who someone is based on what they look like. It is the prejudice that blinds you to the competence sitting quietly in your own ranks. I am telling you this because I learned it the hard way. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest. It is the one who doesn't need to be. Let your actions be your volume, and learn to listen to the silence. Because in that silence, you will find the truth of who is truly in command." The legend of Auditor Sharma, the Praetorian, also grew. But she remained a ghost, a whisper. She would appear in other hotspots, other crisis points, a quiet woman in a simple uniform, observing from a corner. And those few who knew the stories, who knew to look for the small, unassuming tattoo, would give her a wide berth and a silent nod of profound respect. For the story is not truly about a captain or a chief. It is about a fundamental law of the universe that is as true in a boardroom as it is in a battle. True strength is not loud. True authority is not arrogant. It is quiet competence. It is the substance that lies beneath the style. It is the discipline to remain still when all others are in chaos, the wisdom to listen when all others are shouting, and the skill to act decisively when the moment demands it. It is a reminder to us all, in a world that rewards volume and celebrates bluster, that we must never, ever judge the book by its cover. For you never know if the quiet librarian in the corner is, in fact, the one who wrote the entire library, and has the authority to burn it to the ground if she deems it necessary.